This is Liam talking about publishing in style with XML. This is not Liam talking in style about publishing. Words are important things, aren't they? Okay, and a graveyard. So just to give a little bit of context, is anyone here using XSL-FO? Awesome. Great. So XSL-FO is not dead. Lots of people here are using it. Unfortunately, not many people want to work on it today. We closed the working group because no one was showing up. Is anyone here using CSS? No one, okay. Is anyone here programming Perl? Okay, wow, all right. People will admit to it. This is good. I don't know if you read XML Dev, but there was a thread recently talking about how bad all Perl programs are and how everything in Perl is crap based on having glanced at a Perl script 10 years earlier. Well, that's what it felt like reading it. You know, 20 years ago, I looked at Perl and it was a mess, and therefore all Perl is a mess and it continues a mess. I've met people who looked at XSLT not 20 years ago perhaps, but 12 years ago, and one person had just inherited 1 million lines of XSLT to maintain. But formed an opinion and then said, I ran screaming. That same person actually became quite a fan of XSLT, so it's worth looking back, it's worth going back. But I'm sure there are people here who remember printing with a web browser like Mosaic or Netscape, and it printed, and when it got to the bottom of the page, if that was halfway down a line of text, well, it broke the characters in half and started on the next page with the bottom half of the characters. It really did. Today, things are different. Cool, that's good. So, I'll have to try not to do that, sorry. So we're making CSS better. I work full-time for the World Wide Web Consortium, and part of my role is in the publishing activity to try and make CSS suitable for publishing books. So should you move to CSS is one of the questions that I'll be trying to give you some context to answer. There isn't an easy answer today. According to Publishers Weekly, printed book sales in a number of areas are increasing, continue to increase. It tends to be things like reference books and art books and photography books and children's books. Certain areas of children's books, not all areas. Sales of aircraft manuals have also increased, but Publishers Weekly doesn't track that. That's just because some big airplanes sold. And XSL-FO is not dead. I come neither to praise it nor to bury it, because it's going to continue to be around as long as people use it, and there are still products and they work. We've got plenty of people in this room using XSL-FO, and I've not come here to say stop. So why am I here? Why would you look at CSS? Well, let's look at some reasons. This is the logo of the Open Web Platform. Has anyone here used the web? A couple of people at the back. Okay, great. So websites, of course, use HTML or compatibly XHTML if you use the polyglot form, and CSS. Has anyone here used CSS? I don't think I've asked that question. So, yeah, anyone here allergic to shellfish? All right, because I'm going to be talking about crab salad sandwiches quite a bit. So EPUB 3, of course, uses HTML5. EPUB 2 used XHTML 1.1 with CSS. And if you're a publisher, you're quite likely to have to share CSS style sheets with your EPUB productions, with the web, maybe with internal sites. And if you can if you can talk to a designer who is a web designer or an EPUB book designer, then there's someone who knows CSS, probably, or at least has some idea of what you can do with it, because otherwise you're wasting your money and you're talking to the wrong designer, right? So it turns out, once you've done the EPUB design and you're simultaneously working on the print design, lead times are different, but the designers have to work to both platforms. And you don't want to talk to two designers, partly because that's expensive, but partly because you should always talk to an odd number of people so you get majority opinion, right? You certainly don't want three designers in the same room. That would be as bad as having three software architects in the same room. So what's happening is the large publishers are employing designers who are familiar with CSS to design print books. Of course, they're familiar with print as well, but they're increasingly familiar with CSS. And what they're finding is when they move to CSS for print, that their time to market goes down. One of the big 6 publishers told me that they'd gone down from 6 weeks to 2 weeks to do the formatting for a typical New York Times bestseller style of book that's producing a print book from the XML files that they've got, or XHTML files in their case. They were taking 6 weeks with XSL-FO, they're taking 2 weeks today with CSS. And that's largely, my take is that's largely about the people they've got and their environment and the tools they've got. But the tools they've got are based on the open web platform. They're based on the web. Or at least the interface to those tools is on the web. Okay. So I mentioned Perl, and 300 years ago when CSS implementations were pathetic, and the CSS Working Group decided not to do advanced features like page numbers, and running headers and footers and footnotes. They called them advanced features. That's not me being sarcastic. They actually used that phrase. And quite a few people remember CSS that way. But CSS has changed. It's not what your great-grandma used. It seems to be causing hysterics over there. Hopefully it's someone else. And CSS now has more than 60 documents making up the specification. It's a bit of a nightmare. They all interact with each other in undocumented ways, in ways that are not obvious. The platform itself, using CSS, the next layer up, has matured into a platform that's being used for fairly complex web applications today. It's almost as good as a graphical toolkit of 20 years ago. But it's distributed, which the toolkits weren't. It's pretty hard to find your way around, and the focus of development has been on web applications. Focus has not been on print and what they call paged media, which includes ebooks that don't scroll, but you swipe to get to the next page. Or if you're George Beaner, you swipe and your book goes onto someone else's phone. There's probably laws against that. So it's been pretty bad, but it's changing. Things are changing. And we saw that it was bad. We're not actually angels, but maybe give me some poetic license here. How do we fix things? Well, to try and understand the problem, W3C has run a series of workshops. We're continuing to run the workshops. I'll talk more about those in a moment. We've started a digital publishing activity. And we have a digital publishing interest group. This is currently member only. You have to be a W3C member or invited expert to participate. And the reason for that was that it was an incentive to get publishing companies to join W3C, and it has actually been working. Publishers are by no means the only people that are targeted by CSS for print, obviously, but they're one important group. And one reason for targeting them is that book production is moving to CSS, and I don't want crap books. Does anyone here want crap books? That's sounds like one of those political statements, doesn't it? You know, the Facebook, you know, share this if you don't want crap books. Now you can't hear me at all. Sorry. Can you still hear me at the back? Do you want to hear me at the back? No, never mind, don't answer that one. I don't want to know. We held, one of the workshops we held was in Paris last September, was specifically about workflow using the web and about going to print. And it was interesting to hear from, the proceedings are public, you can see them. It was interesting to hear from O'Reilly, who's using the Antenna House formatter and CSS. It was interesting to hear from Hachette, who's using prints. I get this wrong about half the time, actually. I get them the wrong way around. But Hachette is one of the big 6 publishers. They produce, I think it's 8,000 titles a year or something. So every year they're producing more than O'Reilly's ever produced, to put it in perspective, because O'Reilly is one of the most visible in our world. And they're doing, I think they're doing about 1,600 ebooks a year through prints and CSS. And that week of the workshop, 4 of the books in the New York Times bestseller list, 4 of the top 10 were done with prints, and 2, it happens, were done with Antenna House, with CSS. That's 6. I believe all or most of the others were done with XSL-FO, by the way. And to the person, whoever tweeted about you don't want poor quality books, I'll note that you actually, in the Antenna House case, it's the same renderer, right? So I will explain in a minute what I mean by crap, but what I don't mean is poor rendering quality from professional quality rendering engines using CSS. Actually, it's getting pretty good. Okay. So XSL-FO people, this diagram, yes, it fitted, good. This diagram is not unfamiliar to you, partly because I stole it from the W3C website for XSL-FO, but then I put it there in the first place, so I kind of feel justified. You take your input documents, you go through XSLT to XSL-FO, and you produce PDF with a renderer of some kind, right? But we want to format, well, maybe we don't want to. Some of us want to format XML with CSS and get comparable output. We want to do this. We want to take arbitrary XML and a CSS renderer and produce beautiful output. Note that a CSS renderer does not have to be a web browser. I'm not expecting right now a web browser to produce book quality output, which is just as well, because if I was, you'd say I was on crack. And although the convenience store next to my hotel sells marijuana drinks, it doesn't seem to sell crack drinks. Actually, I didn't ask. CSS is meant for styling HTML, though, and there's a whole bunch of semantics in it that get really confusing if you try and apply it to general XML. You quickly get on your own. These days, it can almost do namespaces, but there's a lot of limits. So our goal of arbitrary XML instance through CSS to PDF, we have to rein back a bit and say, let's say XHTML or maybe even HTML5. Has anyone here heard of HTML5? One person near the back. He's editing it. All right. But there's some limits. Big one is that CSS can't reorder content. It's not entirely true, and as of this week with or last week with the CSS, the oddly named CSS regions spec. I say oddly named because after lots of discussion internally, what it's got left in it is named flows. So the CSS named flows spec called regions has just gone forward, and there is some reordering of content in the generated content and paged media module. But CSS is not good at reordering content. It doesn't have transformation built in. when you use HTML, you're stuck with browser-centric markup. We've seen various, at this conference, we've seen various attempts to change that, to get round it, and with more or less success. But the way of thinking is about what will the browser do with this. We saw this right at the start of the conference with the ability to add your own elements with web components. But the first question is, what can they do? We add behavior. What does the browser do with this? Not what information is being modeled. HTML did come from tech publishing, so it's not impossible. And I've said that. But in practice, what we do is we do a transformation. So we take our input documents and maybe we do an XSLT transformation into XHTML, and then we apply a CSS renderer and get our beautiful output. And if we do that, we can do things like a table of contents. Okay, I'm going to, before you try and read that, I'll take it away. I'm going to give you a few examples of things in CSS to give you a feeling for some of the differences between formatting with FO and formatting with CSS. And I found out at lunch there's an error on one of my slides, so someone will spot it, I hope. The prize is a free glass of water. So, XSL-FO is an XML vocabulary that uses CSS properties. So you say things like block, or almost all the examples say FO:block. I think this was done deliberately to try and frighten HTML people away from XSL-FO. There's nothing to stop you declaring the default namespace on the top and just saying block. So I do that. Block font size equals 12 point plus 1 millimeter. That's a perfectly reasonable thing to do in XSL-FO. My goodness, I'm going slowly, aren't I? CSS has values, not expressions. That's the first thing you'll run into, and you use calc to get your expressions back. But the other thing is, instead of putting the CSS onto the element it applies to, you use selectors to join them. And CSS style rules cascade so that all applicable rules are merged and later ones override earlier ones. And CSS, of course, does not have page templates. So all the content comes from the document. What this means in practice is in your XSLT transform, you put a whole lot of stuff in there that you then take out again with CSS and use in various places around the page. Okay. So here is a formatted book. This was not done with CSS. Formatting a book. When you're formatting a book, the first thing you do is you think about pages, and then you go down to the text level. Then you go down to how do the pages interact with each other, spreads. At some point you talk about binding and finishing, distribution, and metadata. W3C is having a metadata workshop in April of this year. Metadata for publishing and annotations. How do you annotate web pages? How do you annotate ebooks and share that? Here is some CSS for defining a page. You can say page size A4, or you can give width and height, especially if it's not one of the about 6 built-in page types. Here's an example of generated content. So you can make a running header page and then refer to the page number counter in CSS. I've said that. You can have fixed content, position fixed in CSS. Roughly corresponds to static content in a page master in XSL-FO. You can set strings in an element. You can say when we get to this element, set a string and use it. And you can also move an element complete with its structure out of the document flow and put it into a header or footer. So there is some reordering, and you can now get complex markup in headers and footers, and that is supported. I've tried it in Antenna House and Prints, for example, Prints XML. If you're doing a table of contents, though, you have to include it in the document. You can't generate that in CSS. And page numbers and dot leaders you have to do with CSS. I won't go over this, but if you're interested, the talk will presumably be linked from the conference slides. I'm going to be told I'm over in a moment. No? Okay. The good news, though, is that we do have a panel after this, so if the questions can continue in the panel, I think we'll be on topic. Not immediately after, but one. I used in the example I didn't go over here, I used a selector in the CSS at the top, which is quite a complicated thing. I should tell you about it. div.contents ul li a : after. CSS web people will go, eek, that's really inefficient. And you should put greater than signs in there to say immediate child of and use a subject indicator, but in fact you don't care when you're not doing a web page because the difference is measured in milliseconds. What you do care about is an error in those things is almost impossible to debug, and you'll spend a lot of time trying to figure it out. And the great thing about using XHTML is that there's this fabulous debugging tool. Has anyone here done inspect elements in Chromium or Chrome browser? I'll ask the other way around. It appears about half. Has anyone not seen it? Okay, no hands. All right. So if you generate HTML for print, you can look at it in a web browser. About a fifth of your CSS will be ignored by the web browser, and it'll all come out crossed out because the web browser doesn't support paged media. But it doesn't matter because typically what you're trying to debug is things that it does support, and you can right-click and find out which selectors applied and why. And that is the most time-saving tool imaginable. And the neat thing of using HTML for doing your publishing is you get that benefit, that kind of network effect. And CSS style rules combine. It's different from XSLT, where a template is either used or not used. In CSS, different bits of a rule are used. The individual pairs get used or override others, and so only some of them get used. So that can be exciting. What am I doing? Okay. The numbers are meaningless on this. If you try and do a baseline grid, which is a fundamental thing for typesetting, you'll find you can't do it in CSS and you'll go crazy, and that's a current area of work in the CSS Working Group. Indexes, similarly, you can't merge index entries in CSS. XSL-FO does that in the formatter. If you're doing back-of-the-book indexes to any great extent, you'll want to use XSL-FO, not CSS. At least for the index and probably for the whole thing to get the page numbers right. In the print formatter, you may be able to do it in JavaScript, but there's no standard way of doing it. Actually, I need to skip this one because this is the one I found. The third point on this is actually incorrect, I think. But does anyone here know what those are? Does anyone here not know what those are? They're all gone to sleep. Those are pieces of type. Those are actually less than and greater than signs produced by a monotype machine. And CSS has support for open type features. You can turn open type features like historical ligatures, ranging, non-ranging, table figures, small caps on and off. And that's supported. There is support for that. But there's a whole bunch of things that XSL-FO does, CSS doesn't. So when I talk about books being crap, a lot of it is not, in fact, about the page rendering, which is getting really good in CSS. A lot of it is about things like complex tables and table headers repeating from table to table. It's about positioning of footnotes, whether you can have per column footnotes. It's about spanning between columns. It's really easy to get started with CSS, it turns out. The difficulty with FO is that you have to master XSLT, and you have to have quite a big understanding of FO before you can get Hello World working. Now, once you've got up that learning curve, you can do a lot more than you could with CSS. Right? But it's a learning curve. It's difficult. With CSS, you can take pretty much a plain text file, put a few tags in there, hope they more or less balance, add a CSS rule, and you end up with something awesome. Well, okay, maybe you don't, but you end up with something formatted. And the value of that should not be underestimated. Okay, I'm almost done here. I want to re-emphasize W3C process means the public has a huge voice. CSS gets talked about on the style mailing list, which is very busy, but if you send formal comments on any spec to that list in the way that the spec tells you to, they have a little piece of text you have to put in square brackets, or in some cases you can enter something in Bugzilla. It unfortunately varies based on which of the 60 specs you're commenting on. You do have a voice because it will be considered by the working group, and the spec can't go forward until it's resolved. And the good news is we do have people doing commercial book formatting and commercial print formatting with CSS in the working group now. And they are listened to. The working group goes quiet and listens when they speak, which is a huge step forward. So you can join, watch for announcements. Next workshop is in April, as I mentioned, on annotations. It's in the Bay Area in California, not the Prague Bay. Is there a Bay? Yeah, all right. I think that's all I needed to say, and I've got to 0, so apologies.
We do have time for one question. Anyone?
I've sent them all to sleep. Oh, yeah, this one.
Right here.
Well, just a small question. What I've always been missing in CSS is constants. Like constant.
I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing you. Can you speak slowly or into the microphone?
Okay. What I've always been missing in CSS is things like constants. A constant for specifying the font height. A constant for specifying some width or the name of the font.
I think what you're saying is you've missed constants. Like you want to be able to say page width or left margin is 1 inch. And then add left margin to an offset. And you can do that now using custom properties. So for example, in the selector for colon root, which selects the top of the document, you can say var-page-width colon 9 inches. And you can go and get at that with var open paren page width, close paren, and you can use that in calc for an expression. It's too new to expect it to be implemented, but it took me about an hour to implement it in XSLT, in fact. I pre-processed my CSS with XSLT and implement that so that when the implementation that I'm using supports it, I can just turn that off in my XSLT and use it natively. And sorry.
Is it less than sense or pre-process?
Yes, there are other preprocessors for CSS which do it as well. I prefer not to use a preprocessor if I can help it, because then when I try and open the thing in the browser to understand it, I find my CSS has been transformed into something I no longer understand. So, okay.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Right, if there's any more questions, just queue them up for the panel we'll have. Right, thank you, Liam.